My name is Richard Lawson. I am 65 years old, and I thought New Year's Eve would be nothing more than a night of food, laughter, and family. But as the music faded and the glasses clinked, my son-in-law turned the spotlight on us, shaming my family in front of everyone we knew. I stayed quiet, but inside I knew the night was far from over. Because just when the room thought it had settled, the front doors opened, and a man no one expected to ever see again walked in. What followed made the entire room stop breathing. And if you think that was the shock, wait until you hear the rest. The air inside the Lawson house that New Year's Eve carried the smell of roasted ham, sweet rolls, and champagne that had already been poured into too many glasses. Laughter floated around the room, cousins hugging cousins, old friends shaking hands, and the crackle of a fireplace making everything seem warmer than it really was. Outside, Denver was freezing, the streets covered in slush from the last storm. But in here, people were sweating in their holiday sweaters and sparkling dresses. I stood near the wide window, a glass of ginger ale in my hand, watching my daughter Emily smile politely at yet another relative she barely knew. She looked tired the way only a mother of a toddler could look, but she forced her smile to hold steady. Her husband David thrived in moments like this. He shook hands with his colleagues he had invited, slapped shoulders, cracked jokes that weren't all that funny, and made sure every eye found its way to him. It was his house, his party, his stage. When the music lowered and a few glasses clinked together, I felt the shift in the air. David climbed up on the small step by the dining room archway, holding his glass high. His face was flushed from the champagne and the attention, and for a moment the room hushed as if something important was about to be said. I tightened my grip on the glass. My wife had warned me earlier in the week to keep calm to avoid letting anger ruin the night. But as I looked at Emily, holding Lily on her hip, rocking her gently, I sensed nothing good was coming. David grinned, letting the silence stretch. Then he spoke. You know, every family has its place. Some of us work hard, climb the ladder, build something worth showing off. And some people just ride along pretending they belong. His eyes found mine as he said it. The laughter that had started to bubble around the room froze. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Emily's smile vanished, her free hand clutching the back of a chair. I saw her lips pressed together so tightly, the color drained from them. I didn't move. My heart pounded, but I stayed where I was. David took another sip, enjoying himself. Tonight is about celebrating success, about showing what it looks like when someone makes it. Not everyone can say the same. His gaze swept the room, but came back to me again, sharp and deliberate. The silence was heavy. A woman coughed somewhere near the piano. I turned my eyes toward Robert and Helen, his parents sitting stiffly near the fireplace. They looked down at their laps. Neither of them opened their mouths. Even his own parents said nothing. Emily whispered something to Lily, her voice breaking. My granddaughter fussed, sensing the tension. I felt the sting of humiliation run hot in my chest, but I forced myself not to react. Not yet. David smirked. Sometimes we invite people into our homes out of kindness, but that doesn't mean they actually fit. Some families. He let his words hang there, dangling like a noose. A cousin at the back muttered that maybe he should sit down, but David raised his hand, brushing it off. Emily finally spoke, her voice low. David, enough. He looked at her and chuckled. Relax, it's a joke. Can't anyone here take a joke? But no one laughed. I shifted my weight, set my glass down on the windowsill, and nodded slowly. I let him see that I had heard every word, that I understood exactly what he was doing. But I gave him nothing more. The room remained still. Music had stopped entirely. Guests stood with their drinks halfway to their lips, waiting. Then from somewhere beyond the front hall came the sound of a door opening. The cold air rushed in, and voices quieted even more as footsteps echoed on the hardwood. Every head turned toward the entryway. I kept my eyes on David. His smirk faltered just slightly, as if he had heard something he didn't expect. The doorframe filled with a tall figure that had not been seen in this house for decades. My brother George, his hair silver, now shoulders broader than I remembered, stepped inside carrying a worn leather coat draped over his arm. The room gasped. People had believed he was gone for good. I did not move. I only nodded again this time with a weight David could not possibly understand. And as George walked further into the room, silence pressed down on every corner of the house. The night had just shifted, and no one breathed. The pause that followed hung thick, holding back what was coming next. George stood there in the doorway like a ghost, come back to life. And for a heartbeat, I could not move. My brother had been gone for more than 20 years, off chasing whatever life he thought was better without us. His face was older, carved with lines of time, but his eyes were the same piercing blue that used to stop me in my tracks when we were kids. People whispered around us, the clink of glasses forgotten. David shifted on his step, suddenly smaller, though he still tried to hold his smile. Emily gasped, her free hand covering her mouth. I felt the weight of 2 decades press on me, but I refused to let it show. I only nodded once more, letting George's presence sink into the silence. That was when my mind slipped back the way it always did in moments too heavy to bear. I remembered Emily as a little girl running across our front yard in Aurora, in her pink overalls, her hair tied in messy braids. She was my only child, my late-in-life miracle. And from the moment she was born, I swore to protect her from every storm. Her mother, Jane, used to tease me for being too cautious, but she knew it came from love. When Emily was in her 20s, she met David. It was the summer of 2016. She had just finished her teaching degree and was working at a small elementary school, bright-eyed and full of energy. David came along at a 4th of July barbecue, introduced by a mutual friend. He was charming, funny, and he knew how to look people in the eye as if they were the only one in the room. I did not trust him right away, but Jane did. She said he was ambitious, that he had a good job at a tech company in Denver, that he could give Emily stability. He laughed easily, told jokes that made even my neighbors lean in closer, and he held Emily's hand like he meant it. Within a year, they were inseparable. By the fall of 2017, he proposed during a hike in the Rockies. Emily came home breathless, her hand stretched out the ring, catching the afternoon light. I tried to be happy. I really did. The wedding was big, too big if you asked me. Both families pitched in for a down payment on their first home, a modest 2-story in a suburb just outside Denver. I remember looking at them on the dance floor that night, my daughter glowing in her white dress, David with his confident grin. And I wondered if maybe I was wrong about him. For a while, things seemed fine. Emily called me every Sunday telling me about her classroom, her students, and the dinners she and David shared. He cooked sometimes, she said, and he brought her flowers just because. I allowed myself to relax. But small cracks showed sooner than I expected. There was a dinner at our house in 2019 when David made a sly remark about how Emily should not bother with a second degree, because he was already making enough money for both of them. Everyone laughed, except me. I caught the way Emily's smile faltered, how she looked down at her plate. By 2020, his hours at Bright Tech stretched later and later. He told us he was working overtime, saving up for the family they planned. Emily defended him, saying he was under pressure at work. I bit my tongue because what else could I do? When the pandemic hit, Emily taught from home, exhausted, but still dedicated to her students. David, on the other hand, seemed to thrive in the chaos. He bragged about how his company needed him more than ever. He was on his phone during dinner, tapping away, barely listening, when Emily tried to talk about her day. I wanted to step in then, but Emily would only say he was stressed, that I was being too harsh. She told me I had to let her handle her own marriage. So I did, but it gnawed at me every night. Then came 2022. Emily announced she was pregnant. She glowed with a joy I had not seen since her wedding day. David was over the moon, or at least that was what he showed us. He clapped me on the back, promised he would be the best father, that he would work harder than ever to give their baby everything she deserved. But I watched the distance grow. He stayed later at the office. Emily, swollen with morning sickness, called me in tears more than once. She said he forgot to ask how she was doing, that she felt invisible. I told her to come home if she needed space, and she did for a week. Jane and I cared for her, made soups, rubbed her back, reminded her she was not alone. Then she returned to him, hopeful he would change. When Lily was born in early 2023, David nearly missed it. He walked in just as the baby let out her first cry. I saw his eyes well with tears, and for a fleeting moment, I believed maybe the man Emily fell in love with was still there. For a short while, he was tender, holding Lily like she was made of glass, kissing Emily's forehead as she drifted off to sleep. But it did not last. By the time Lily was 6 months old, he was back to his late nights, his phone buzzing at all hours. Emily tried to cope. She was on maternity leave, exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. She told me she felt like a single mother in her own marriage. And when she dared to complain, David would snap. "You always play the 'I'm tired' card," he sneered once at my dinner table. That night, I almost threw him out of my house. But Emily begged me not to. She said she would handle it. I remember sitting up late after they left, staring at the photos on my mantle, my daughter's smile frozen in happier times. I told myself I could not interfere too much, that Emily was an adult. But in my heart, I knew the storm had only just begun. And now, standing in his house with champagne still fizzing in abandoned glasses, watching my brother step into a room that had just witnessed my humiliation, I realized the past was no longer something I could keep tucked away. It was colliding with the present in a way none of us could stop. The silence grew heavier, pressing down on us all, waiting for the next crack to appear. I had seen parties collapse before, but this one was crumbling in slow motion. The music had stopped, the laughter died out, and all that remained was the heavy thud of hearts beating in a room too full of silence. My brother's sudden return was shocking enough, but my mind carried me back to the moment when I first began to notice the ground shifting beneath Emily and David's marriage. It was the spring of 2022, right after the snow finally melted in Denver. Emily called me on a Saturday morning, her voice brighter than it had been in months. She told me she was pregnant. I remember gripping the phone, my chest tight with a mix of fear and joy. Jane cried when she heard her hands shaking as she pressed them to her mouth. For weeks, our house smelled of chicken soup and lavender, because Jane kept preparing little care packages for Emily, determined to make her feel supported. David at first seemed thrilled. He came over with flowers, kissed Emily's hand at our dinner table, and told us he was going to be the best father. He promised to take on extra hours at Bright Tech to make sure their child never wanted for anything. I wanted to believe him. But almost immediately the cracks widened. He stayed late at work more often, sometimes not coming home until past midnight. Emily's belly grew, and with it grew her exhaustion. She would call me in tears, saying she felt invisible, saying David never asked about her doctor's visits or the nausea that kept her in bed for days. I told her to come home whenever she needed a break, and she did. That July, she spent nearly 2 weeks in her old bedroom. Jane would bring her ginger tea in the mornings and rub her back when the sickness became too much. I would sit with her at night, listening to her talk about the nursery. She dreamed of how she wanted soft green walls and a crib by the window. She was clinging to hope even as David texted her less and less. When she finally went back to him, I prayed things would improve. They did not. In September, she called me late one evening. I could hear her trying not to cry. Her voice hushed because David was in the next room. She told me he had come home grumpy, thrown his bag on the floor, and asked why there was no dinner ready. She explained she had been sick all afternoon, barely able to stand. His reply was sharp and cold. "You always play the pregnant card." I felt my hands tremble on the receiver. I wanted to drive over right then, but Emily begged me not to. She said she needed to handle it herself, that interfering would only make things worse. I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of man could talk that way to his wife, his unborn child's mother. By the time winter came, her belly heavy and round, David had grown even more distant. He would pat her stomach in front of friends, brag about becoming a dad, but behind closed doors, he disappeared into his phone or claimed he had to run back to the office. I knew something was wrong deeper than just work stress, but I did not yet know how wrong. January of 2020. 3 arrived with icy winds. Emily went into labor on a Friday morning. Jane and I rushed to the hospital, her hand gripping mine so tightly I thought the bones might break. Hours passed, Emily crying through the contractions, sweat soaking her hair. David was not there. He texted once saying traffic was bad, that he was leaving work. He walked in minutes before Lily's first cry. He looked shaken, almost as if he had not expected to make it. He held Emily's hand, then kissed her forehead, and for a moment I saw tears in his eyes. I almost believed in him again. For the first few weeks, he acted like a father. He cradled Lily with surprising gentleness, posted photos online about how blessed he was, even made Emily tea while she napped. I wanted to let myself relax. But it was an act that did not last. By the time Lily was 6 months old, Emily was worn down, her body aching, her mind stretched thin from nights with no sleep. She said Lily cried for hours with colic, and David would step over burp cloths on the floor, kiss Lily once on the head, and leave for work with his coffee mug. One evening, I dropped by unannounced. The living room was dim toys, scattered Emily sitting on the couch with Lily pressed to her chest. She looked like she had not slept in days. David walked in as I sat there. He looked at Emily and frowned. "You're still sitting there. Nothing's ready." Emily tried to explain she had been up since dawn, but his tone cut like a blade. "You barely do anything anymore." I stood my fists tight at my sides. Jane touched my arm, a silent reminder not to explode. Emily's eyes pleaded with me too, so I bit my tongue, though every part of me burned. When they left the room, Jane whispered that she did not like where things were headed. I agreed, though I did not say out loud, the thought circling in my mind. This marriage was breaking, and I feared my daughter was breaking with it. The memory of those months pressed on me as I stood again in David's grand living room, the crowd still stunned into silence. My granddaughter shifted uneasily in Emily's arms, sensing the tension, though she could not understand it. George's presence hung heavy. David's smile had slipped, and I knew he remembered those same months too. He knew I had been there, that I had seen the way he had treated Emily when she was at her most vulnerable. The silence held waiting, the air brittle with the weight of what had yet to be said. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and faint coffee from the nurse's station down the hall. Snow pressed against the window flakes, sticking and sliding down the glass. Emily lay in the bed, her face pale with exhaustion, her hair damp against her forehead. I held her hand, whispering steady words, though my own heart raced with every sound from the monitor. Jane stood on the other side, brushing damp strands of hair back from Emily's cheeks. Hours had crawled by each contraction, stealing the strength from my daughter's body. The doctor kept checking, saying progress was slow but steady. I could see the fear in Emily's eyes and the way she searched the room every time the door opened. She was waiting for David. He had promised to be there. He had left work late, he said, but was on his way. He was not there. Emily squeezed my hand so tightly that I thought the bones might crack. "Dad, She whispered, her voice hoarse. Is he coming? I swallowed hard. He'll be here. Just focus on Lily. You are not alone. But deep down, I wondered if she was. By the time David finally walked through the door, the sound of our granddaughter's cry had already filled the room. Emily lay back against the pillow, tears streaming down her face, her chest heaving with relief. He froze in the doorway, his tie loosened, his hair wind-blown as if he had sprinted. His eyes went wide, and for a moment he looked like a man broken open. He rushed to her side, pressing kisses against her damp forehead, saying he was sorry that traffic was a nightmare, that he had not meant to be late. I stood behind him, silent, watching. I wanted to believe the look on his face, the tears that welled in his eyes. Maybe he had realized something. Maybe this was the turning point. For the next 2 weeks, it seemed like it might be. He held Lily with hands so careful it surprised me. He rocked her in the chair by the window, humming songs off key, his eyes tender. He brought Emily cups of tea and even made dinner once or twice. I caught myself exhaling in relief, letting hope creep in. But hope was fragile. By the end of that first month, the flowers on Emily's nightstand had wilted, and so had David's effort. His phone buzzed constantly, even at night. He took calls in the hallway, whispering, saying he had to keep up with work. He came home later, and later, his excuses piling up. One evening, Jane and I stopped by to drop off some soup. Emily answered the door with Lily on her hip, dark circles under her eyes, her robe hanging loose. The smell of sour milk and unwashed laundry hit me before she even spoke. David was nowhere to be seen. Inside, the kitchen sink was stacked with dishes, bottles drying on the counter. Emily set the baby down in the bassinet and tried to smile. It collapsed almost instantly. I am drowning, Dad, she whispered. He doesn't even see me. Jane gathered her into her arms, and I stood there, useless rage pressing hot against my chest. I wanted to storm out to find David, to drag him home by his collar. But Emily shook her head before I even moved. Don't. Please. If you fight him, it will only make him crueler. So I stayed quiet, and I hated myself for it. By the summer, Emily's maternity leave was ending. She talked about going back to teaching, maybe part-time, but David insisted she should stay home longer. He said it would be better for Lily. But I could hear the control in his voice. He wanted her dependent, tied down. I remember one night in July when Jane and I invited them both for dinner. Emily looked worn thin, her blouse hanging loose on her shoulders. David showed up late, phone in hand, barely apologizing. When we sat down to eat, he glanced at Emily's plate and smirked. Careful, Em. You don't want to end up bigger than you already are. The fork slipped from her hand. Jane gasped. I slammed my fist against the table so hard the glasses rattled. David leaned back unbothered, that smug grin tugging at his mouth. Emily whispered, please, under her breath. I forced myself to sit back down, my hands trembling. I had promised her I would not interfere, but every bone in my body screamed to tear him apart. After dinner, when Jane was putting dishes away, Emily came to me quietly. Her voice broke as she said she sometimes wished she could just pack a bag and leave. I told her she always had a place at our home. Always. 2 weeks later, she showed up at our door with Lily, a small suitcase rolling behind her. She did not say much, only that she needed space, that David had been cruel again. I carried her bag inside, and Jane made up the guest room with clean sheets and lavender lotion on the nightstand. For 3 weeks, she stayed. We held Lily in the evenings, we cooked meals, we gave Emily rest she had not known since before the pregnancy. I thought maybe she was finally breaking free. Then one morning she packed her things. David had come to her apologetic, saying he wanted to do better. He promised he would change. Against everything inside me, I let her go back. Standing now in David's glittering living room, surrounded by guests too polite to speak, I thought of that day the way I had watched her leave our house with Lily balanced on her hip. I had felt helpless then. Tonight, though, I was not helpless. George had stepped back into my life, the brother I thought was lost. And I knew he had not come empty-handed. The silence after David's insults still hung in the air, brittle and waiting. But I could feel the storm building. It was only a matter of time before it broke open. David's apology after Emily came back never felt real to me, and I did not have to wait long to see why. For a few weeks, he played the role of the repentant husband. He cooked a few meals, brought home flowers, even sat through one of Emily's endless stories about her students with what looked like patience. But the mask slipped quickly. It started with little comments. He would hand her cash instead of leaving the debit card, saying it was easier that way. When she wanted to buy diapers in bulk, he told her not to waste money. Then came home the next day with a new watch. He framed it as responsibility, as if he were protecting the family budget. But I knew control when I saw it. One afternoon in the fall, Emily brought Lily over to my house. Jane was in the kitchen, and I was setting up the crib we kept for naps. Emily sat on the couch silent for so long, I finally asked what was wrong. She told me David had started giving her an allowance, just enough for groceries, and when she asked about the rest, he snapped. He said he worked for it, so he decided how it was spent. Her voice broke when she said she felt like a child begging for pocket change. I clenched my jaw so hard, my teeth ached. I wanted to march over there and demand answers, but Emily grabbed my hand. She said if I confronted him, he would only punish her more. So I sat there holding her hand, my heart heavy with helpless rage. Thanksgiving that year was hosted at their house. The table was spread with turkey and sides, family-gathered laughter filling the air. But under the surface, tension crackled. I watched David pour wine for himself and his parents, then glance at Emily and say she did not need any. His voice carried sharp enough for everyone to hear. She laughed it off, but her eyes darted to mine across the table full of shame. After dinner, while others were watching football in the living room, I caught Emily alone in the kitchen. She told me David had started criticizing her cooking her clothes, even how she held Lily. He called her lazy, said she had lost herself. I held her as she cried against my shoulder, the sound muffled by the dishwasher's hum. By Christmas, the control had deepened. David had moved all their accounts into his name. Emily said she did not even know the passwords anymore. He told her it was easier for taxes, but I knew better. She said he carried his phone like a weapon, never letting it out of sight. I asked if she thought he was seeing someone. She shook her head, but her eyes betrayed her doubt. January of 2024 was bitter cold, and I will never forget one night when Emily called me, her voice trembling. She said David had come home angry that she had spent too much on groceries. She had bought a few extra jars of baby food, and he had thrown the receipt on the counter, yelling that she was reckless. I drove over in the dark, Jane in the passenger seat. When we arrived, Emily sat on the couch, her arms wrapped around Lily. Her face was streaked with tears, and David was pacing. He looked at me and smirked as if daring me to say something. I wanted to, but Emily's eyes begged me not to. So I held my tongue for her. But inside me, the resolve hardened. I realized then this was no longer just about David being distant or selfish. He was tightening a leash around her neck, and he wanted her cut off from everyone who might pull her free. When we left that night, Jane turned to me in the car and said what I had been thinking for months. If he keeps this up, he will crush her spirit completely. I gripped the wheel, the snow tapping against the windshield, and told her I would not let that happen. Now standing in his grand living room, nearly a year later, I saw the polished marble floors, the chandeliers, the expensive champagne, all of it built on control and cruelty. He thought this was his kingdom, that he could humiliate us all in his own house. But I knew something he did not. His kingdom had cracks running deep, and sooner or later the foundation would give way. The guests shifted uncomfortably, whispers starting up again. George still stood by the doorway, his presence like a shadow David could not ignore. Emily held Lily closer, her shoulders trembling. I felt the weight of the past year pressing in on me, every cruel word, every receipt slammed on the counter, every tear Emily had shed in my arms. The silence at that party was not just from embarrassment. It was the silence of a storm about to break. I had lived long enough to recognize the weight of secrets. They never stayed buried, not forever, and David carried them around like stones in his pocket. The first real crack showed itself in the glow of a phone screen. It was late one night in the spring of 2024. Jane and I had been watching television when the phone rang. Emily's voice was low, trembling. She asked if I could come over. By the time I got there, Lily was asleep in her crib, and Emily stood in the kitchen, her face pale, her hands shaking as she held David's phone. She told me he had gone out to the garage to make a call and left it on the counter by mistake. A message had popped up. She could not help herself. She read it. "You left your sweatshirt here. I miss you already. Can't wait for next time." The name attached was Julia. Emily's eyes filled as she whispered that she had no idea who Julia was. My heart sank. I had suspected for months, but seeing the proof shattered any hope I had been clinging to. When David walked back in, Emily shoved the phone toward him. "What is this?" His face hardened. He snatched it from her hand and barked that it was a coworker, that she was reading too much into it, that she should stay out of his business. I stepped forward, my voice steady but low. "Your wife is your business, David." He turned on me, his jaw tight. "Stay out of it. This is between us." Emily's shoulders sagged. She whispered that she was sorry, that maybe she had misunderstood. I wanted to shake her to make her see she was not at fault. But the look on her face told me she had already been beaten down, too many times. That night I called my old friend Mark, a lawyer I had known since high school. I asked him to look into David quietly. Mark owed me more than one favor, and he agreed. Within weeks, he had answers. Julia was a secretary at Bright Tech. She and David had been seen leaving together more than once, sometimes after hours, sometimes on weekends. Mark even pulled a credit card statement that showed charges. At a downtown hotel, charges David could not explain away as business. When Mark slid the papers across my kitchen table, I felt both rage and relief. Rage that he had humiliated my daughter, relief that I finally had proof. I did not tell Emily right away. I wanted to protect her, but I also wanted the right moment. I knew if I confronted David too soon, he would spin it, gaslight her until she doubted her own eyes. In the meantime, the cracks widened. David grew bolder. He took calls in the middle of dinner, excused himself from family gatherings, even missed Lily's second birthday party, claiming a work crisis. Emily cried in the bathroom while balloons sagged in the living room. Jane whispered to me that Emily could not take much more. She was right. One evening in the fall, I drove Emily and Lily back to their house after dinner at ours. As we pulled into the driveway, David was standing by his car phone pressed to his ear, laughing. He saw us and hung up quickly, his smile fading. He asked Emily coldly why she was late. She said she had told him she would be at our house. He rolled his eyes and muttered something about how she was always running back to Daddy. I felt the heat rise in me, but Emily touched my arm. "Not now," she whispered. So I held my tongue, but I knew this could not last. Mark kept digging. He discovered not only the affair, but also strange transactions at Bright Tech. Money moved from project budgets to accounts that did not make sense. I asked him what it meant. He said it smelled like fraud. If David was caught, it would not just ruin his marriage. It could ruin his career. I thought about telling Helen and Robert, his parents. But whenever I looked at them at family dinners, sitting politely, never speaking against their son, I doubted they would believe me. They would probably say I was biased, that I hated David from the start. Still, secrets have a way of surfacing. One night while Emily was at our house, David showed up unannounced. He walked in without knocking, his face tight, his voice sharp. He said Emily had embarrassed him, that she should stop running to her parents every time they argued. Jane stood tall, her hands on her hips, and told him he had no right to barge in. He sneered at her, then turned to Emily. "If you can't handle being married, maybe you shouldn't be." I stepped between them. "Enough. You're in my house, David. You will not speak to her that way here." He stared at me, his eyes dark, before finally storming out. That night, as the house settled back into silence, I knew the storm was almost here. Mark had more evidence, and George had agreed to come back into the picture. It was all coming together like pieces of a puzzle I had been too tired to finish before. But puzzles can only hold so long before the final piece locks into place. Back in the Lawson living room on New Year's Eve, I looked around at the frozen faces, at Emily clutching Lily, at George standing firm by the doorway. David's secrets were pressing in from every side, and though the guests did not know it yet, the truth was about to tear through that house like a gale. The storm had begun to gather, and there would be no stopping it once it broke. I had always known David's hunger was not just for admiration or control over Emily. He wanted something more solid, something he could put his name on and wave around as proof of his success. That truth revealed itself the night he finally spoke of my will. It was October, a quiet Sunday. Jane and I had invited them over for dinner, hoping to keep the peace. Emily looked worn down, her voice soft as she tried to keep Lily entertained with blocks on the living room floor. David leaned back in his chair after dessert, swirling the last of his wine. His eyes found mine, and there was no warmth in them. "You've got that house in Aurora and a decent retirement," he said casually, almost like a joke. "I imagine you've got a will written up. You should think about making things easier for Emily. You never know what could happen." My fork stilled. I had never spoken to him about my estate. The only people who knew my intentions were Jane and Mark, who had helped draft the documents. Emily looked confused, her brows knitting. David smiled, as if he had only made a passing remark, but I saw the calculation behind his eyes. Later that week, Emily came by without him. She asked me if I had ever mentioned money or property to David. I told her the truth. My estate plan was simple. Emily was my only child. Everything would eventually go to her and Lily. But David had no business knowing the details. She whispered that he had pressured her to ask me. He wanted her to bring it up to see if there was a way to put his name on something. She said she felt sick even saying it out loud. That was when I realized he was not just controlling her day-to-day life. He was setting his eyes on what I had built over 65 years. I called Mark again. I asked him to make sure the documents were ironclad, to protect Emily and Lily from any manipulation. He reassured me they were, but I knew a man like David would not stop just because the paperwork was tight. By November, the hints grew bolder. David mentioned selling their house in Centennial to move into something bigger, maybe even the Aurora property, if I was ready to let it go. He said it with a grin, but his eyes never left mine. At Thanksgiving, around the table with cousins and neighbors, he made another remark. "Some families plan ahead," he said, his voice carrying. "They make sure their assets are in the right hands before it's too late." He let the words hang, then lifted his glass. "To good planning." No one said anything, but I caught the way Jane stiffened beside me. Emily avoided my eyes that evening. Later, when I walked her to her car, she admitted David had been hounding her about my accounts. He wanted her to ask for copies of the trust to find out how much was in it. She told him no, and they had argued for hours. She looked like she had not slept. That night after they left, Jane turned to me and said what I already knew. "He is circling Richard. He will not stop." I thought about George then. My brother had been absent for so long, but when we spoke briefly on the phone that December, I told him the outlines of what was happening. He listened quietly, then said only this: "When the time comes, I'll be there." The days leading up to New Year's were tense. Emily called me twice in tears, saying David had left papers on the kitchen table. Power of attorney documents. She said he told her to sign them, that it was just in case something happened to me, it would be easier for the family. She had refused, but he had been furious. I told her to bring the papers to Mark. She did. Mark said they were dangerous, written to give David full control over any assets tied to Emily. He told me to lock everything down, even tighter. When I saw Emily on Christmas Eve, she looked fragile, her smile brittle as wrapping paper. Lily toddled around the tree, unaware of the storm brewing over her parents. David poured drinks for the guests, his arm around Emily's shoulders, his laugh too loud. He looked like a man already celebrating his victory. But I knew better. As I stood in that New Year's party, staring at the chandeliers and the crowd that had fallen silent after his insult, I thought of those documents, those smirks, those veiled threats. He believed he was entitled not only to Emily's obedience, but to the very foundation of our family's security. I felt George's presence behind me, steady as a wall, and I knew the time had come. The storm had been building for months, and tonight it was going to break wide open. In the final hours before the New Year's party, the Lawson house was dressed like a stage, waiting for its actors. Crystal glasses lined the bar, trays of shrimp and pastries filled the dining table, and garlands of silver and gold shimmered along the staircase. From the outside it looked perfect, but inside I felt the weight of a storm pressing against my ribs. Emily had arrived early with Lily, her hands full of diaper bags and toys. She looked pale under the soft glow of the chandelier, her smile quick and thin. I offered to hold Lily while she helped set up, but Emily shook her head and kept the little girl close as if the child were her shield. David was everywhere at once, adjusting the lights, greeting the caterers, making sure the music playlist was timed just right. He thrived on appearances, and tonight was his masterpiece. His voice carried through the room smooth and confident, but I caught the sharpness when he leaned toward Emily. "Make sure you don't embarrass me tonight." I heard it clear as day. She flinched, and my hands curled into fists at my sides. As guests began to arrive, coats were whisked away, and laughter spilled into the house. Old college friends of David's neighbors, from Centennial colleagues from Bright Tech. They shook his hand, clapped his back, and toasted with champagne before the clock even neared midnight. Emily floated through the rooms, like a ghost, smiling just enough, holding Lily until the baby fussed, then retreating to the nursery upstairs. When she returned, I saw him waiting for her near the kitchen. He blocked her path, his hand firm on her arm. "You've been gone too long," he muttered. "People notice when the hostess disappears." Emily whispered something about Lily needing her, but he waved it off. "They came for me, not for you." I stood only a few feet away, close enough to intervene. Emily caught my eye and gave the smallest shake of her head. "Not here. Not yet." So I stayed rooted, though the taste of bile rose in my throat. The night stretched on. At one point, David raised his glass in the living room, announcing how blessed he was, how hard he had worked, how this house was proof of determination and vision. His words dripped with pride, but his eyes flicked toward Emily, as if daring her to contradict him. Then came the moment that sealed it for me. A cousin had complimented the spread of food, and David chuckled loud enough for everyone to hear. "Emily tried to help with the menu," he said, "but let's be honest, she can barely manage dinner most nights." Laughter bubbled from a few guests who did not know better, but the room shifted. Emily's face flushed red, her lips pressed together, and she stared at the floor. That was the crack I had been waiting for. George had not arrived yet, but I knew he was coming. We had spoken only once on the phone in December, his voice older but steady. He had promised me he would walk through those doors when the time was right. Until then, I had to hold my ground. Around 11, Helen and Robert arrived, David's parents. They looked elegant, as always, Helen in a navy dress, Robert in a gray suit, their smiles polite but stiff. They kissed their son's cheek, hugged Emily lightly, then took their seats near the fireplace. I watched them closely, wondering if they sensed what their son had become, or if they would sit silent again. By now the house was full laughter and clinking glasses echoing off the walls. But beneath it all, tension pulsed like an undercurrent. Jane stayed near Emily, guiding her toward friendly faces, keeping her from being cornered too long. I moved through the crowd, speaking little, watching everything. Just before midnight, David gathered everyone in the main room. He wanted the spotlight one more time before the countdown. He raised his glass, his voice ringing with false warmth. "Some families know how to rise above," he said. "Some know how to build something worth celebrating. And some—" He paused, his eyes sweeping until they landed on me. "Some just linger pretending they belong." The words cut through the room like a knife. The laughter stopped. Glasses froze midair. Emily stiffened beside me, clutching Lily tighter. Even Helen and Robert looked away, their faces pale. I set my drink down slowly on the windowsill. My heart hammered, but my expression stayed calm. I nodded once, nothing more. The silence that followed was thick, pressing against the walls, waiting for something to shatter. And then, as if on cue, the front door opened, letting in a gust of cold air. Heads turned, whispers sparked. A figure stepped inside, tall and broad-shouldered, his hair silver under the glow of the chandelier. My brother George, gone for over 20 years, walked into the Lawson house as if he had never left. The room gasped. David's smile faltered. Emily's eyes widened with disbelief. I stayed still, my chest tight with a mix of dread and relief. George looked at me across the room, and in that silent exchange, I knew the time we had been waiting for had finally arrived. The countdown to midnight had not even begun, but the night was already on the edge of breaking apart. George did not rush or speak right away. He let the door close behind him, his eyes sweeping across the crowded room as if he were measuring each face, weighing the silence that had fallen. His presence alone unsettled the air. People whispered to each other, asking who he was, while others simply stared, trying to piece together the sudden shift in the night. David was the first to break. He stepped forward, his laugh forced sharp at the edges. "Who let you in here? This is a private party." George's gaze did not move. He walked further inside his coat, still damp from the snow outside his boots, steady on the hardwood floor. "Nobody let me in," he said evenly. "I came because I needed to." My chest tightened. Emily's grip on Lily grew firmer, and Jane moved closer to her, as if forming a shield. Helen and Robert exchanged a quick glance, their polished composure cracking. David puffed out his chest, turning toward the guests with a smirk. "Folks, don't worry, just a confused old man who wandered in. Nothing to see here." He reached for George's arm, but George pulled back, his voice carrying over the chatter. "I am not confused. My name is George Lawson. I am Richard's brother." The air thickened instantly. Heads turned toward me, and I felt the weight of dozens of eyes. I gave a small nod, confirming it. Gasps rippled through the room. David's smirk vanished, replaced with a sneer. "That's impossible. You're supposed to be gone." George stepped closer, his voice still calm but laced with steel. "You wish I was gone? That's the story you all told, isn't it? That I disappeared, that I left without a word? But the truth has a way of finding its way back, no matter how deep you try to bury it." The tension crackled. Helen's hands trembled where they rested on her glass. Robert looked like he had aged a decade in a second. David barked a laugh, though it wavered. You think you can just walk in here after 20 years and demand a seat at the table? Nobody knows you. Nobody cares. George looked straight at him. I didn't come here to take a seat. I came here to stand with my family. He turned his eyes to me, and in that moment, I felt the old bond we once had. The bond that had survived time and silence. David's face darkened, his voice rising. Family. You think you have the right to use that word after what you did? You abandoned everything. The guests shifted uncomfortably, whispers spreading like sparks. Some of them clearly knew nothing of the Lawson family history, and yet they leaned in, hooked on every word. I cleared my throat, my voice steady. He didn't abandon us, David. That's a story you tell because it's convenient. The truth is more complicated, and tonight you're going to hear it whether you like it or not. David's jaw tightened. His eyes darted to Emily, then to me, then back to George. He was cornered, and he knew it. George's voice dropped lower, but it carried to every corner of the room. I stood back for too long. I let lies fester because I thought silence would keep the peace. But silence only feeds rot. I came back tonight because this family deserves better. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly, the seconds dragging like thunder. The crowd barely breathed. David finally snapped. He pointed at George, his voice sharp and commanding. Get out. You don't belong here. George did not move. He looked past David at Emily holding Lily, her eyes wide with fear and hope all tangled together. Then he looked back at me. I stand with them, George said. With Richard, with Emily, with Lily. That is my family. The room erupted with whispers, some gasps loud enough to echo. Emily's breath caught and Jane reached for her shoulder, steadying her. David's face drained of color. He tried to laugh, but the sound cracked halfway out. You think anyone's going to believe you? You think anyone cares what some washed-up ghost has to say? George's eyes didn't flinch. They will, because the truth is about to come out. The countdown had not started yet, but I felt it ticking all the same, each beat of silence, a drum, each glance between guests, another spark waiting for the fire. And in that fragile quiet, I knew we were standing at the very edge of the night, the line between the lie David had built and the truth that was about to tear it all apart. George's words hung in the air like a match held over dry timber, and it did not take long for the fire to catch. David's voice shot back louder than before, his cheeks flushed with rage. You don't know what you're talking about. You've been gone for decades, living off God knows what, and now you want to stand here and preach about family. George did not blink. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slim envelope, his hand steady as he placed it on the edge of the grand piano near the fireplace. The room hushed again, every eye fixed on that plain white slip of paper. Inside this are records, George said calmly. Not stories, not rumors. Records. David's laugh was brittle. Oh, I'm sure. Another sad attempt to smear me. He looked around at the guests, searching for support, but their faces betrayed unease. Helen spoke for the first time, her voice shaking. David, what is he talking about? David snapped his head toward her, his tone sharp. Nothing that concerns you. Robert rose slowly from his chair, his frame stiff, but his presence commanding. His voice cut through the noise. If there is truth in what he carries, we deserve to hear it. George nodded once and slid the envelope closer to me. I opened it, my fingers brushing over bank statements, printed emails, even copies of receipts. The words blurred for a second, not from age, but from the weight of it. Fraud. Money siphoned from Bright Tech into accounts tied to David's name. Hotel charges overlapping with company retreats. transactions to a Julia M., thousands of dollars disguised as consulting fees. I lifted my eyes. The silence was unbearable. David lunged forward, snatching at the papers, but George was quicker. He placed a heavy hand over them, his jaw tight. "You will not hide this anymore." The guests began to murmur, pieces of the puzzle falling together in their minds. His late nights, his arrogance, his sudden wealth. Emily's voice trembled as she finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "Julia." David froze. For a flicker of a second, his mask cracked, his lips parting, as if to deny it, but nothing came out. The weight of his silence told us everything. Helen's face drained of color. She steadied herself on the arm of her chair, her voice breaking. "My God, David." Robert's hand clenched at his side, his voice rough with disbelief. "You shamed your wife, your daughter, and now this." David's composure splintered. He barked out desperate words, claiming it was a setup, that George had faked it, that Emily had planted it. He pointed at me, his finger trembling. "You're behind this. You never wanted me in this family." I kept my voice low, steady. "You did that yourself?" Emily stepped forward, her shoulders trembling but her chin lifted. "All those nights, all those lies. You said you were working for us, for Lily, but you were working for yourself and for her." Her words cut sharper than anything George or I could have said. The guests shifted uncomfortably, the perfect New Year's evening unraveling in front of them. David's eyes darted wildly, searching for escape. He turned back to George. "You've been gone 20 years. Nobody will believe you." George's gaze did not waver. "They don't need to believe me. They can see you for what you are." As if the house itself had been waiting. The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime, its heavy tolling echoing through the room. 11:45, 15 minutes to midnight. The timing was merciless. Helen sat down slowly, her head bowed. Robert stood rigid, his jaw clenched, his son's disgrace laid bare in front of neighbors and colleagues. The guests whispered, some already edging toward the door, others frozen in fascination. David tried to gather himself, straightening his jacket, forcing a laugh that did not reach his eyes. "This is all nonsense." He gestured toward George. "A bitter old man looking for attention. And you, Richard, you let him walk in here and ruin our night." I stood tall, feeling the years of restraint lift from my shoulders. "This was never about one night, David. This was about every night you thought you could humiliate my daughter and still stand above us." He sneered, but the words caught in his throat. The countdown to midnight loomed closer, but the night had already begun to fracture. Guests waited breathless for what would come next. And I knew in my bones that the storm had only just begun to unleash itself. The room felt smaller with every breath, as if the walls themselves were closing in on David. He kept pacing in front of the fireplace, his hands twitching at his sides, his laugh too loud, too brittle. He wanted control, but it was slipping and everyone could see it. George stood steady, his presence anchoring the chaos. Emily clutched Lily to her chest, her face pale but her eyes sharper than I had seen in months. Jane stayed close, one hand resting lightly on Emily's arm, the other clenched tight. Robert finally broke the stalemate. His voice was low but firm, cutting through the whispers. "David, tell me right now, are those records true?" David's head snapped toward him, disbelief flashing in his eyes. "Dad, you can't honestly be siding with him. With them, after everything I've done for this family." Helen rose slowly from her chair, her movements deliberate. Her voice cracked but carried weight. "What have you done for this family, David? You've humiliated your wife, lied to your daughter, and now we hear of stolen money and affairs." She shook her head, her eyes wet. "You've dragged us into shame." For a moment, David looked like a boy again, cornered and desperate. But then his jaw tightened and he lashed out. None of you would have anything if it weren't for me. This house, these parties, the respect you get in town. You think any of it came from Richard or George? It came from me. The arrogance in his voice made the guests stir. Some whispered in disgust. Others edged further away as if afraid of being too close to the blast. Emily finally stepped forward, her voice shaking, but strong. We never wanted this house, David. We never asked for your respect or your parties. I wanted a husband. Lily needed a father. She looked at him with tears brimming. But you gave us nothing but shame. Her words hit him harder than anything George or I could have said. His face twisted, his voice rising. You ungrateful woman. Do you know what I've sacrificed? George moved closer, his voice calm but steady as a stone. You sacrificed nothing. You took, you lied, and now it's over. David's eyes darted wildly, his hands clenching into fists. For a moment I thought he might strike out, but the weight of the room held him back. Too many witnesses, too many eyes. The clock chimed again, 11:55. The crowd was hushed, the only sounds the clinking of ice in abandoned glasses and the soft cries of Lily against Emily's shoulder. Then came the blow no one expected. Mark, my old friend, stepped through the archway from the foyer. He had arrived quietly late, but he was holding a folder in his hand, his face grave. I asked him to come, I said softly, my voice carrying just enough. David's eyes widened, panic breaking through his mask. Who is this? Mark set the folder on the table. I am an attorney. These documents are already in motion with Brighttech and the district court. Fraud investigations do not wait for New Year's to pass. The gasp that went through the room was louder than any fireworks outside. David lunged toward the folder, but Robert stepped between them. Enough. His voice was sharp, commanding in a way I had never heard from him before. You will not touch it. Helen sank back into her chair, tears sliding down her cheeks. Emily buried her face in Lily's hair. David looked around the room, searching for someone, anyone to side with him. But every face was turned away, cold or pitying, no longer supportive. His voice cracked as he shouted, You're all making a mistake. You'll regret this. The clock ticked closer to midnight, the seconds stretching out like a drumbeat. Guests stood frozen, torn between watching the unraveling of a man and counting down to a new year. George leaned closer to me, his voice low. It's almost time. And as I looked at the broken figure of David in the middle of his glittering living room, I knew George was right. The final reckoning had not yet arrived, but it was close enough to touch. The last 5 minutes of the year ticked by, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Fireworks cracked faintly outside in the distance, but in that room, the only explosion was the unraveling of David's pride. His face glistened with sweat. His hands shook, and every inch of him looked smaller than he had ever allowed himself to appear. Robert stood tall by the fireplace, his jaw locked, his son's disgrace sitting heavy on his shoulders. Helen's hands were clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white, her eyes fixed on the floor as though she could not bear to look at him. George stayed rooted near me, his presence solid, the one thread holding this moment from spiraling into chaos. Emily cradled Lily, her chin high, even though her eyes glistened with tears. Jane rubbed her back, whispering soft words of strength. David tried one last push. He shouted that none of it was true, that it was all fabricated, that I had planned this with George to ruin him. His voice cracked, and the desperation in it betrayed him. The guests looked at him with pity, some with disgust, none with belief. Mark's folder still lay on the table. I stepped closer, placed my hand over it, and spoke. These documents are already with Brighttech and the courts. Nothing you say here tonight can change that. David staggered back, his mouth opening and closing, like a man drowning in shallow water. Emily's voice cut through the air, soft but clear. "We're done, David. I will not raise my daughter in the shadow of your lies." The words silenced him. For the first time since I had known him, David had no retort, no sneer, no control. The clock struck midnight. The room counted down out of habit, but there was no cheer, no joy, only a hollow echo of voices against the glittering silence. Fireworks burst outside the windows, streaks of light cutting across the sky. But inside the Lawson house, the only light that mattered was the release in Emily's eyes. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Mark had already made the call. When the officers stepped through the door, David did not resist. His shoulders slumped. His face pale, and he allowed them to lead him away, while whispers followed him out. Helen sobbed quietly into Robert's shoulder. Robert's eyes never left the floor. Emily walked to me, then Lily, on her hip, her other hand trembling as she reached for mine. "Thank you, Dad." Her voice broke, but her grip was firm. I pulled her close, kissed my granddaughter's head, and felt the weight of a year's worth of fear finally lift. Jane joined us, and then George. For the first time in decades, my brother stood with me, not in words, but in presence. The silence between us healed. The guests filed out one by one, murmuring their goodbyes, leaving behind the remains of a night no one would forget. The glitter, the champagne, the chandeliers all looked different now, hollow stripped of their shine. When the house was quiet again, I sat with Emily and George by the fire. Emily asked me if things would ever feel normal again. I told her the truth. It would not be the same, but it would be better. Because this time, the truth had been spoken aloud. Weeks later, Bright Tech announced David's termination. Charges followed, and the story spread through the local papers. Neighbors who once praised his charm now shook their heads, muttering about arrogance and greed. His fall was quick and complete. Emily filed for divorce with Mark's help. The judge granted her full custody, citing David's instability and financial misconduct. For the first time in years, Emily's shoulders relaxed when she walked through her front door. Lily giggled freely, unaware of the storm that had passed over her head. George stayed close. Slowly, carefully, we began to rebuild what time and silence had stolen. For Emily, it was a new beginning. For me, it was proof that, even after decades, family could still find its way back. That New Year's party had been meant to celebrate David's empire. Instead, it became the night his empire crumbled. And in its ashes, we found something worth far more than chandeliers or champagne. We found our way back to each other. If you've stayed with me until the end, I'd love to know what you think. Do you believe justice always finds its way, no matter how long it takes? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to stay with the channel. There are always more truths waiting to be told.